Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Dave, last week we were talking about branding,
right,
and really trying to get our minds around how to apply that whole framework of thought, branding, to important political topics like the Republican Party. I mean, we can debate this, but it's hard to imagine many brands today that have less value than the Republican brand. And so, talking about that, but also I kind of want to move us in a direction talking about the brand of America.
Right.
You made a comment, and I'm hoping you'll kind of refresh for listeners who maybe didn't hear last week's podcast, just kind of summarize your overall understanding of what branding is, help the listeners understand that. And then I want to apply it not just to the Republican Party. I want to talk about the Democratic Party, what its brand is and how that came to be, but also something even bigger like the United States.
Sure.
The United States has a brand, and what is that brand? Who can influence what that brand is? What can citizens do, and how to think about this? So maybe the place to start, sort of refresh for us. What should we think about when we think about branding? Because I think a lot of people think of logos and icons. They think of, the Pepsi symbol or the Coca-Cola symbol or the four little circles that stands for Audi, right? Or
the Nike swoosh, the Apple.
Yeah, that's
so
what they
so
think
forth.
of when they think of brand, is the logo.
Before I even get back into that, I love that you brought up the idea of branding America. And because for those who didn't know, when you and I first started working together, 5 years ago, give or take now, I was actually working under a brand of my own called Brand the Republic. My idea was, my goal was to work with people like you who were doing things to brand our country and help them through that process. So going back to what we talked about last week, just the quick, most important definition anybody can take away from it is a brand is not an icon. A brand is not a logo. A brand is an emotion. More importantly, it's an emotional connection that somebody makes to an organization, a product, a person, that I guess any noun, right? The emotional response you have internally to when you hear something or see something or feel something or smell something that triggers a thought of that, right? One of the most overlooked brands, I think, in our country's history. I want to watch your responses because I think it'll have it. Mrs. Fields. Because you walked the cookie.
Yeah.
Because when you walked into a mall, any mall in the country in the 1990s, and you took a smell, you smelled Mrs. Fields, and it made you feel great, right? Even if you didn't go eat one, we loved that feeling that we had when you smelled that warm chocolate chip cookie that was being baked by Mrs. Fields.
Really appreciated having Mrs. Fields, even not that everybody's going to go get cookies, but just because it made the whole mall smell good.
Without a doubt. But that's a brand, right? Most people, they probably couldn't even remember, what is the size of a Mrs. Fields cookie? What does it look like? What were the different flavors that they had? All of those things. But that smell, they remember that instantly. It's just one of those things. And that is a brand. It's an emotional response you have. So when we talk about that in politics, right, the emotional response becomes anger or pride.
Let me ask, I want to ask here a couple questions just on this general concept of brand and branding before we go turn to the political direction. So a brand is an emotional response, and different people have very different emotional responses, often to the same stimuli, to the same phenomenon, to the same thing. One person might, hear that a baseball game is on and get really excited, like me. And someone else might hear the exact same baseball game on TV or radio, whatever it is, and think, oh, boring, right? That's the last thing. That means baseball has a very different brand for me than it has for someone else. When it comes to branding, I'm not even sure how to phrase this question the right way. What matters most? The effort of the organization or product or business to create a certain response, or the various responses that people are going to have regardless of what the business or organization does? I don't know if that makes sense. But it's kind of a two-way street, right?
It's a really important question. It's something we talk about extensively, that you're not going to get everybody. There's no brand in the world that everybody is going to like. It's impossible. This goes back to your teaching of we're all different. We're all unique. Some people are tall and some people are short, and so on and so forth. We all have different tastes. We all have different preferences. There's no company that can create a brand that every single person is going to like.
So I'm thinking, I just want to give an example here to make it more concrete. A company like Audi, they make cars, including some high-end cars. And I think Audi has really gone to great lengths over recent decades to create this brand of, among other things, safety. We build really safe cars. God forbid you're ever in a wreck. We don't want you to be in a wreck, but if you are, you want to be driving one of our Audis because it's really safe. Now, there are people out there who have accepted that branding. Said, yeah, man, if I could afford any car, I want to get a really safe car like an Audi. Yeah. But then there are other people who hear the same marketing language, the same branding imagery, and they think to themselves, that is just a snooty, overpriced German car, for rich people who want to show off. I would never drive one of those.
So from a business perspective, Audi's job is to determine, of the people who like that image, who have a positive image of Audi, is there a business there? Can they build a business on the people who think of Audi as a nice, fun sedan to drive or SUV to drive? 2, it's a safe SUV to drive, and 3, they can afford it.
Right.
So if you think about those 3, can you find enough of an audience to say, yeah, we can attract these people, we can get these people on board, and there's going to be enough of them to come buy our cars that we can have a business.
So at some point, at some level, that really becomes just crunching some numbers. Sit and say, we think there are this many people. If it costs us this much to build a car, if we can sell it at this much profit to 100,000 people or 100 million people or whatever the number is, right? They crunch the numbers. Then we have a sustainable, profitable business.
And if they don't, if they look at the numbers and they say, you know what, there's not enough people here who are going to buy this. There might be a small few. It's a couple of Venn diagrams, right? I just named 3 things, and those 3 things are all circles in a Venn diagram, and they're looking for the people within the group that where all 3 bubbles cross. If there are not enough people in there for them to run a profitable business, then they have to change the business, and then they build a new brand, and they can stick with part of it to say, okay, safety is our brand, so we're going to stick with the safety side of it. But maybe we shouldn't put such high-end finishes in our car. Maybe we should start considering cloth interiors instead of the nice leather and wood. Maybe we should start considering a cheaper engine or better gas mileage that can bring it down into a group of people who don't need to spend as much money, who are looking for safety. Then you start talking, well, does that put us in a competition with somebody like Volvo? And it's a business decision from there. But the brand is something that can be malleable. It can be manipulated. It can be changed by the owners to ensure that they find that audience that makes enough sense for them to go out and say, we can build this product and there's enough people out there to buy it.
So I think that is a perfect setup. There's a lot of meat to chew on just in how you've described branding so far. And clearly, right, it doesn't take a lot of imagination or knowledge to understand that there are companies that invest a lot of resources and a lot of time, a lot of energy, right, thinking about their brand. Mm-hmm. Big, successful companies that have been around for many decades and growing all the time. They think a lot about their brand. They go to great lengths to protect their brand. If someone is in any way harming their brand, right? Saying the brand isn't what it claims to be, or selling knockoffs, right? That would damage the brand.
Absolutely.
Where those companies, they try to stop that as quickly as they can.
Teams of lawyers out there ready to stop that.
So thinking about that, Coca-Cola is always thinking about its brand. Gatorade is thinking about its brand. Audi and Volvo and Apple and all these big successful companies. Now let's take that frame of mind and look at the Republican Party. It too is a big thing. It's a big thing. many, many millions of registered Republicans spread across the United States. It's an old thing. It's been around since 1854. Are there people like there are at Apple and Coca-Cola and Volvo and Audi? Are there people at the Republican Party who invest the time and the attention and resources to thinking about the Republican brand and trying to craft the Republican brand? Because if there are people, I kind of know who they are, and I might go punch some of them.
Here's the hard part, and this comes from experience on my end. I spent 2 years in a role like that. I spent 2 years in a role doing branding for the Republican Party on a more local level, but
so it's your fault.
Yeah, it's my fault. But we ran into a problem on day one, and this was something I realized on the very first day of that experience, and that was you can't control everybody. If you're Audi, you can tell all of your employees, you can tell all of your salespeople, you can say, here is our brand, and you stick to this. I think we've talked about this in the past. I used to work for BMW,
right?
And at BMW, we were told very specifically, here is our brand. Here is what you're supposed to talk to people about. Here's how you're supposed to direct people. And if you don't do that, we're going to have a conversation.
And I suppose it helps tremendously in the modern era of mass production, especially when we're talking about a business that sells a product, a physical, tangible product, like a car or a computer or a bottle of soda, whatever it is. The mere fact that it's mass produced means every single unit is exactly the same.
You'd hope.
You would hope so, right? It should.
Yeah.
I mean, they all get produced in the same, factory or assembly line or whatever it is. So that fact establishes a powerful, strong base of consistency. Now, there's a human element, right? You're going to have people who are salespeople and marketing people. So those people you have to train. Here's how we talk about our product, right? Here's how we market. Here's how we sell, so on and so forth. But you do have these things that are all pretty much the same versus something like a very human organization like the Republican Party.
Right.
You cannot say all the candidates they don't look the same. They don't sound the same. The truth is they're not the same. Some are very smart and thoughtful, and some just are not, and all kinds of other differences.
And it goes beyond that. I think you can have very smart and thoughtful people who disagree on what the brand is and promote it in a different way, right? So you can't convince everybody to always talk, right? If I'm a candidate, if I'm running for the House of Representatives in Colorado, let's say, and I'm putting that out there right now. I have zero interest. I'm not running. If I was running for office and I had the National Party come to me and say, okay, here's the brand you're running on, and I didn't believe in it, I would say to them, okay, what are you doing to help make sure that I win with your brand? And if they don't give me the tools, if they don't give me the assets, whether it's commercials, whether it's development of marketing materials, literature, signs, everything else, I'm sitting there and I'm saying, you don't know what's best for me in my district in Colorado.
Right.
I'm running my own campaign. So how do you brand a party? Well, what ends up happening is the party ends up running on this issue of you've got the National Party saying our brand is this. You've got candidates running for office. Remember in 2015. Wow, that was that long ago. 2015, we had 17 or 18 candidates running for president of the United States in the presidential primary for the Republican Party. Yeah. And every single one of them said the Republican Party was something different. Donald Trump versus Rand Paul versus Jeb Bush. You could not have found more diverse thought in those three candidates alone, let alone the rest of them on stage, like Ted Cruz.
Well, you start to see already, we haven't even gone very far down this path. You already start to see enormous problems and challenges, right? Because you have different people have different views of the Republican Party. You have some candidates who are really going to highlight that they're a Republican. They're going to put that out front. Mm-hmm. Vote for me. I'm a Republican. And here's my understanding of Republican. And it might be different than what other people say. You have other candidates who really downplay their Republican affiliation. They might not talk about it much at all. And all these candidates have their own individual brands, right? I love that, Jeb Bush has a very different brand than a Rand Paul.
Yep.
And then how millions of voters or potentially voters see these people is all different.
And then you get into this idea of, okay, so who are people voting for? And when people go out and vote, if the Republican Party is saying our brand is this, maybe at that time, I think we would argue fell closer to the Jeb Bush, Carly Fiorina type of model in that primary.
Yeah.
And then people started voting for Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. Well, wait a minute. What's the brand here? And your customers help define your brand. Your customers are the ones who are talking. If the party is a representative of the people that are within it, of its membership, especially in that case, then what does your brand become when you might say our brand is this, but people are voting for a candidate that doesn't represent X, they're voting for a candidate that represents Y.
Boy,
it's really hard to say, no, our brand is still this. Yep. You're just electing a candidate over here.
It is it's a tremendous, it's a question. It's a real challenge. I mean, I think myself, and I'm going to make the same disclaimer as you are. I don't want anyone to expect me to run for anything because I'm not. If I was running for Congress, I almost certainly would have a brand, a personal brand. My campaign would have a brand that would be different from the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I might very likely call myself a Republican, but I would say here, I stand for the principles of the American founding and constitutional government and really a very robust, active idea of citizenship. That's the brand that I would run on. And the Republican Party might say, no. We're all about immigration and taxes and something else. And yet, if I won, it raises the question, well, who's right about that brand?
Exactly.
Right? I say the Republican brand is this. The party says it's something else. The voters elect me. Even if the voters didn't elect me, let's say I lost. Does that mean the party is right about their brand? I mean,
well, that's the argument that's happening right now, though.
Yeah.
The argument right now is there's a question of what the Republican brand is, and then there's the Donald Trump brand. And a lot of the Trump candidates lost in this last election, and everybody's saying, so is the Republican Party something else, or is it Donald Trump?
Yep.
And that's when this whole thing gets confusing. Now, I just want to quickly lay out the other layers of how complex this gets, just for people to really see. You have the national party. You have all the candidates who run for president, vice president, and everything that goes along with that. You then get the Supreme Court justices that are nominated by the party. Mm-hmm. So does Brett Kavanaugh or Clarence Thomas or Amy?
Well, they're nominated by a president, right? And the president is affiliated with a party.
Yeah. So if Donald Trump is saying Clarence Thomas, let's say he nominated Clarence Thomas. I know he didn't, but if he nominates Clarence Thomas, is he saying that's what a good American should be? That's what a good citizen should be. And therefore that's the definition of what I want the Republican Party to be. It starts to get muddled. Then you have think tanks, more think tanks than we can count at the moment. Yeah. You've got all these think tanks saying, you want to be a good conservative? Here's what you have to be. And you've got the American Enterprise Institute promoting a very neocon mentality. And you've got Cato Institute promoting a very libertarian personality and approach.
You've got the Heritage
Foundation representing something along the lines of Reagan, Reagan conservatism. You've got new groups promoting this new national conservative movement and nationalism and Christian nationalism. And you've got all of these different things. So that's just on a national level. Then we go down to states, and every state has a Republican Party. And what is the Alabama or Mississippi or Tennessee or New York Republican Party? How does that compare to the California Republican Party or the Colorado Republican Party? Yep. And are their messages the same? And is the National Party giving reason for those to think that? And then you've got all the candidates running at a state level. Yep. And then you break it down to the county level and the municipal level, where you've got parties at those levels. You've got in Colorado, we've got the Denver Republican Party and the Douglas County Republican Party and the Jefferson County Republican Party. And they're all within a few miles of each other, yet sometimes have vastly different.
Some of our listeners may not know this about you. You spent some time actually working within a county Republican Party, the Denver County Republican Party. Does a county organization, a county chapter of a party, have much leeway in terms of defining itself? Or is the state or the national, RNC, are they saying here is your marketing material that you're going to use?
They don't give us anything. They National gave almost nothing. The one thing that the National sent out was, here's a list of things that happened on social media this week that you might want to share with your constituents. And that went from the national party to the state party to the county party.
Yep.
There was nothing. There was stuff for the national candidates. Yeah. I was there when Trump was running for office. So they were getting Trump signs to give out and things along those lines. But
a county, or for that matter, a state party, I mean, they could come out and say, we're all about, I don't know, racial diversity and LGBTQ agenda and affirmative action. That is our, and a Republican organization could do that.
Yep.
And the national organization really doesn't have any power, authority to say, no, that's wrong. Now, at the state or county level, you might anger some donors.
Right.
And that would be right. That would hold the party accountable. Those donors might say, well, if that's your agenda, then I'm not giving you any money. Fair enough. But as an organization, every level is pretty free to say what they want to say and create the brand they want to create.
And not only that, as you talked about Audi earlier, the Audi brand, they're trying to decide with our Venn diagram, do we have enough customers?
Right.
Every political party, every Republican party at every level from top to bottom, every Republican party is trying to decide what is our Venn diagram that we get enough donors, right? It all comes down to money.
Yep.
So how do we get enough donors in the door giving enough money to be able to effectively run campaigns, to effectively host assemblies and conventions and everything else that we need to do to succeed as a party? So when you're doing that, you're looking at it and saying, what does our brand have to be to attract those donors? You're going to get markets where supporting Donald Trump in 2018, for example, wasn't going to get you enough donors in certain parts of the country.
Right.
And if you did, you were not going to get the donors and you couldn't function as a party. That was a conscious decision to sit back and say, we know what our donor base looks like. We know what our customer base looks like. For us to have enough customers to function as an operation, we have to embrace this brand. And sometimes that was anti-Trump. And I saw that with people all over the country.
So if I'm following you correctly, the brand that a party adopts at a particular level could be a county party, it could be a state party, it could be the national party. I'm going to say this in kind of a crass way, just to be really clear. They're really kind of catering to or pandering to existing opinions, preferences, prejudices, whatever you want to call them. If there's a group of people out there who love Trump, then the Republican Party that's connected to that group, they're going to push Trump.
Sure.
If it's a group of donors and or voters who don't like Trump, then they're going to stay away. If it's a group of voters out there who really care deeply about the Constitution and constitutional questions and abiding by the Constitution, then you're going to have a party that promotes the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
If, what's much more likely, if you have a group of donors and voters who don't know about the Constitution, don't care about the Constitution, that's just not even on their radar, then that party is not going to talk about the Constitution much or related things.
Yes. So I want to put this back to you because this is where your knowledge of history really comes in. And the question for me has always been, can a party or a group of candidates or the top of the ticket, I think we all agree a lot of the voting is a down ballot is
Yep.
the term we use, right? You
Yep.
start with the governor or the president, whoever's the highest on the ballot, the
Yep.
first election on the ballot. That's what carries people to the polls, and then everybody votes down ballot from there. So can that brand of that, whether it's a governor in a midterm election, a mayor in an off-term election, a president in a general,
Mm-hmm.
can that carry down ballot? And now I go back to Lincoln and I think back to the forming of the Republican Party and the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were the first opportunity where Americans as a whole heard the arguments of the Republican Party, heard an argument for what the Republican Party.
Well,
correct me if I'm wrong on that,
I think what you mean to say is Americans directly, because it wasn't as a whole. It was only citizens in Illinois. People in other states weren't hearing these debates because they were just in Illinois.
But news travels.
Okay.
To an extent,
I see.
right?
Okay.
I mean,
yeah, sure.
And especially as you get into the 1860 election, you had people going back to, well, Lincoln said this or Douglas said this in the 58 debates.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. In fact, a couple things worth pointing out. One is just the obvious historical fact. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, when you step back and look at them, are a really weird thing because individual citizens did not vote for senators.
Right.
That not one person who was standing, ordinary people who came out, usually there'd be 5, 6, 7,000 people would come to stand there and listen to those. Remember, this is before the days of there were no microphones, there were no speakers, right? None of that. So it was just as far as a natural voice could carry, which outside in the wind, right, isn't very far. But the point is, they were not appealing directly to their voters. It was going to be a very indirect thing. What the citizens could do is they could vote for state legislators.
Right.
And then the state legislators could select either Lincoln or Douglas, or if they really wanted to, they could select someone else. So there's that weird thing. The other interesting thing here is it was Lincoln. Lincoln was the one that Douglas did not think those debates were that big of a deal. Bottom line, he agreed to them mainly because he found Lincoln to be annoying. Lincoln kept following him around and giving speeches and to Douglas's groups.
Yeah.
And it was just annoying to Douglas. And Douglas said, okay, I'll agree to your request and I'll meet you for some public debates if you stop following me around. And Lincoln did stop. But Douglas, he was not very well prepared. There were 7 debates. Essentially, I'm painting with a little bit of a broad brush here, but it's basically true. He basically gave the same speech 7 times in a row. It wasn't much different. Whereas Lincoln, he gave 7 sequential speeches, each one built on the last. And to get Lincoln's argument, you really have to read all 7. It's like 7 chapters in a book. And so it's Lincoln who insisted on getting them published. He funded that. He paid for it to be edited, put together, printed up in book form. And everyone thought this was really weird, what Lincoln was doing at the time. Lincoln had a plan, and his plan was to distribute those debates in 1860. And you know where Lincoln really wanted those debates to get to? The South, Southern states, because he knew that Southerners who were pro-slavery, they were not pro-choice, they were pro-slavery. They wanted slavery to be legalized everywhere. They thought it was outrageous that anybody would choose to prohibit slavery, even have a right to choose to prohibit slavery. And so Lincoln does a lot to help turn Southerners against Douglas. And when he turns Southern Democrats against Democrat Douglas, he effectively divides this party. Now, I think there's a lesson there. I should be more confident in this than I am. I think Lincoln did less of marketing and branding in a good way the Republican Party and the Republican cause and the principles of the founding for which the Republican Party was standing. I think he did less of that. I'm not saying he did zero, but less.
I know where you're going.
Than Lincoln is branding Douglas.
Right.
He's branding Douglas and Douglas-style democracy. That word, Democrats back then, they used to talk about their party organization in total as democracy. Democrats they're the democracy. And Lincoln did more than anyone to brand Douglas. In a way, you could say Lincoln did more than Douglas to brand Douglas. And Douglas at first thought it was funny because Lincoln kept calling Douglas an abolitionist.
Yeah.
And Douglas said, sure, Lincoln, try to call me an abolitionist. That's so ridiculous. I'm no abolitionist. I'm not the one who goes around reading the Declaration of Independence, right? That's just silly and ridiculous. Well, maybe it was silly and ridiculous to Northern people in Illinois and Pennsylvania and other states like that. It was not silly to Southern Democrats in Mississippi. They took this dead serious. When Stephen Douglas, if there's even a hint, a whiff that he could somehow be in bed with abolitionists, they were not going to give him the time of day. And this blows up the Democratic Party in 1860.
Sure.
Literally, the Democratic National Convention happens and delegates there from 11 Southern states, they walk out because Stephen Douglas was getting, initially in their early voting, he was getting a majority, but the Democratic Party had this rule. You had to get 2/3 to be the candidate, the nominee. And rather than wait for him to get the 2/3, they just walked out and left, and they end up holding two separate things. Now, I mention all that history because I wonder if there's something of a lesson to be learned. It seems to me, and here I'm going to defer to you from a branding point of view, because you're better at this than I am. I think in the modern period, the last 25, 30 years, I don't think either party has been very good at branding themselves. I think the Democratic Party has been very effective at branding the Republican Party in very negative terms, so that some large number, I mean, I'm talking tens of millions of voting Americans, think of the Republican Party as the party of racism and bigotry and hating gays. And that's about it. That they might not know anything else. They may not be able to name any Republicans, but they think Republican equals hatred. And they learned that from the Democratic Party.
It's an interesting point. So if that is the case with Lincoln, that Lincoln did less to brand the Republican Party than he did to brand the Stephen Douglas and Stephen Douglas's version of the Democratic Party.
Right.
It makes sense when you have a choice of two, when you're just trying to convince somebody I'm the better of the two choices. We hear all the time today, it's the lesser of two evils. Yeah. I'm voting for the lesser of two evils. I did a piece for Independent Journal Review years ago. I think it was actually would have been January of 2017, right after Trump got inaugurated. I wrote a piece because throughout the entire 2-month period between Election Day and Inauguration Day, all we heard was that the 2016 election was a race to the bottom. And I did some correcting on that from a misuse of the term race to the bottom as a term against capitalism. But it did look like it was talked about as Trump saying you could have crooked Hillary. In Trump's words, you could have crooked Hillary, or you could have me. You can have socialist Bernie, or you could have me. And I'm going to be the one to stand up for you. And he didn't really tell anybody what he was going to do. I've said this from the beginning. I voted for Trump with great hesitancy because I really didn't know what Trump was going to be in office. I just knew I didn't want Hillary Clinton as our president.
I'm going to bring another historical example. I think makes this point stronger, and I think maybe we're getting somewhere to a real concrete lesson here. The most important, pivotal, to use an academic phrase, the realigning presidency of the modern period is Franklin Roosevelt. And he too, when I think about this, he first ran he was elected in 1932. He's elected 4 times, 32, 36, 40, and 44. And in that election leading up to 32, the incumbent president of the United States was a Republican, Herbert Hoover. And Hoover's fascinating because Hoover had gained national fame and prominence before he ever ran for office as a guy. He would help organize and fund and raise money to solve natural disasters around the world. There was a terrible flood, I think, somewhere in Africa. And he organized this huge organization to go feed people and shelter people and things like that. There was a terrible drought and a terrible winter in Russia. Lots of people froze and starved. And Herbert Hoover was organizing, sending medicine and food and things like this
As a private citizen, nonetheless.
As a private citizen. So when the stock market tanks in 1929 and the economic crisis we now call the Great Depression sets in, many people thought, well, good for us. We have just the right guy as president. If anybody in America knows how to handle big disasters, right? It's Herbert Hoover. And Franklin Roosevelt comes along. And I think it's very fair to say Roosevelt did less of branding for his own Democratic Party. He didn't even, well, I was just saying not branding, but his own New Deal had virtually no details attached to it at all. He was out there saying, my New Deal is going to make sure that you can stay in your house and you're going to have a job and farmers are going to earn more for their crops that they sell, and all, making all these promises to all the important groups in America of citizens. No one ever bothered to ask how are you going to do this? How is all this going to work? And he never bothered to explain it because the truth is he didn't have a plan for it. Right. In fact, we see over his 4 administrations, he failed on virtually every one of his promises. But what he was really successful at doing was branding Republican Herbert Hoover as a man of inaction. When the world is melting down and the economy is melting down, you know what Hoover's doing? Nothing. He's created no new offices. He's passed no big new pieces of legislation, no programs. He does not want the federal government to come help you. FDR, we're going to come help you. Don't ask me details about that because I don't know them yet, but we're going to come help you. He brands in a negative way, in an unattractive way, Republican Herbert Hoover. And it's starting to make me think that real political success is less about branding yourself or your own party or your own program. It might be as much, if not more, about branding your opponent. It's when I think of it historically, that's kind of the way that it works.
I think historically, you're absolutely right. And you just what you just explained, I just kept thinking it's one more piece of evidence that Biden is the heir to FDR. But Trump is Hoover.
Yeah.
And Biden says Trump gave all these tax cuts and he's helping his buddies and he's doing all of these things. And look at how you're hurting because of COVID, right? We have COVID happening. We have this pandemic and it's killing people.
Yeah.
And he's telling you not to do anything. He's telling you that you don't need a shot and you don't need this and you don't need that. But we're the government. We're here to help. I'm going to bring the government in and help you. He didn't say how. He didn't really talk about what he was going to do. He just said, this guy's terrible. And he let this happen on his watch. And he isn't helping us get through it. And I'm going to bring all the jobs back. And I'm going to, right. Yep. Biden is doing exactly what FDR did then. And it further proves the point. The question then becomes, can the National Party effectively brand itself? Because I will make this argument. This is it true in business or organizations or people. You have more success. It's the old saying, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. You can take that approach. You can brand your opponent as this awful human being who nobody wants to be attached to, and you're going to get some people to help you. But if you can brand yourself as good, you can brand yourself as the embodiment of what is right and what is just and what is important, and everybody really is going to be better because of our party, then I think you can be more successful.
I want to bring up another dimension of all this. So we were talking about branding initially in the business realm, and let me add to this. We've just had this discussion. What we're really saying, to use political lingo, we're saying negative campaigning works. Mm-hmm. That's what we're saying. With Lincoln, it worked. With FDR, it worked. With Joe Biden, it worked. With Donald Trump, it worked. The negative campaigning works.
With John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, it worked.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, this is not new.
Absolutely. Now, when you look at the business world, there is this one big difference. In most markets, for most products and services, there are many competitors. We were talking about car brands. There are many car brands. It's really hard. I don't even know why we started talking about Audi. I think I brought up Audi, but just to go with the example we use.
You've been car shopping. That you must have come across Audis recently.
If you're Audi, man, that is a tall order to go out and create negative brands for all the other car brands, because there's so many. And the truth is, they're not all bad. Some of them excel in ways that Audi doesn't excel in. So in the business world, branding tends to be more positive focused. Yep. Here's the ways we're good, right? Look at us. Look at how shiny and pretty we are, and just not talk about the competitors. But in the political realm, when it comes down to an actual election, most of the time, we're talking about two. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, it's a binary choice, right? I mean, it's either candidate A or candidate B. I mean, I suppose you can not vote at all if you want to, or you can vote for someone else and know that person is not going to get elected. But for most practical purposes in most elections, it's two candidates. And that really is that's a different kind of framework when it comes to this branding, because all of a sudden, negative branding, the opponent, might work way better than in the business realm where you have dozens and dozens of competing brands.
And in politics, I can push it even beyond a two-party system. And this goes back to our podcast from just a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the left to right scale.
Yeah.
Right. You can go out there and say, here's where we are on the spectrum, and anybody to the right of us is bad. Anybody to the right of us on this scale, they're racist. They hate people. They believe in hurting you. They don't care about you. But if you're on our side or to the left of us, we're good. But if you go too far to the left of us, no, you can't do that. Then they become totalitarian.
Well,
and this
is that true? Is that from the point of view of a progressive Democrat? You know, we can throw out some names to make it a little more concrete. And if you're an AOC or a Bernie or I don't know, even someone like a Nancy Pelosi, who in truth, she's probably not nearly as radical as an AOC.
I think without a doubt, you're right about that.
So any of them, would they ever utter the phrase, don't go, but don't be too far left? Is there such a thing as too far left for any of them? Because here's what they know. When you're in that binary, two candidates, two party system, they know that anyone to the left, well, they're certainly not going to vote for a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's AOC or a Nancy Pelosi, they get the votes of all the leftists all the way to the end to, full blown Marxists and communists.
Well, I'm going to say yes. And I'll give you two examples. One's more theoretical. And then one, I'll show you the actual example. The theoretical is George Orwell, right? Everybody forgets that 1984, written by Orwell was a socialist.
Right.
And 1984 was written by a socialist as a warning against totalitarianism.
Yep.
Right. He did not see. He did not see the inevitable creep from socialism to totalitarianism. He never understood that.
Orwell thought you could have a civilized, decent, morally decent socialist regime. And you're right. 1984 was a warning. Here is this danger. It's a possibility. Don't go down that path of totalitarian, tyranny. Just stop at a nice socialist, friendly sort of place.
Then the real example, the 2016 election, especially the Democratic primary, Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton saying, you got to vote for me, but Bernie's a little bit too far to the left. He's talking about things that really we can't be socialists. Let's be honest. We should have a lot of government help and a lot of government intervention. But my brand of government help and intervention isn't socialism. It's progressivism. Right. And his brand is socialism, and that's bad. Right. And neither of them would embrace somebody who was a totalitarian. In fact, they called Trump a totalitarian.
even though Bernie Sanders, what was it? I think he took his honeymoon to, was it Cuba or the Soviet
USSR.
Union? Yeah.
To the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And talked about how it was one of the great regimes that we should try to emulate. But Hillary Clinton very bluntly said, you can't push it to that far left.
Right.
And almost to the point of, there was always that fear for Hillary. She thought, no way would I lose to Trump. But there was that fear of, if Bernie Sanders gets enough votes but doesn't win the nomination, he could run as a third party candidate and be a real threat and do what the Democrats did against Lincoln. What she didn't count on was the number of people who jumped from the Bernie camp to the Trump camp, or the people who were in the Bernie camp who wouldn't vote for her because they were saying nobody to the right of us. Right. So he effectively campaigned on, you cannot be to the right of me on this spectrum, or else we're in trouble.
Really it's a fascinating study in psychology and incentives and how people make choices, to think of that, the fact, and you're right, there were people who were Bernie Sanders supporters who end up going with Trump because they think Trump is at least some big disruptor in a good way.
Right.
In a good way.
He's not part of the establishment.
He's not part of the establishment. And then you also had in the very same election cycle with everyone's hearing the same, branding, marketing jingles out there. You also have progressives saying, no way in hell are we going to support Hillary Clinton because she's just like Donald Trump and all the Republicans. From their point of view, like we're way over here on the left. So it reminds me, it's funny there when I used to teach in Claremont McKenna College. So Claremont is this little consortium of undergraduate colleges. There are 5 of them. And one of them is Scripps College. It's a very expensive, small, elite liberal arts school.
It was a women's college, right?
All women's college. And of all the nuttiness out there on the West Coast, Scripps College is like the central hall for that nuttiness. I mean, it is staffed by radical Marxists and environmentalists, and that's what you get at Scripps. And when I was there, one year there was a big hubbub on the Scripps campus. The students and faculty were protesting over the selection of the speaker, the keynote speaker for their graduation commencement event.
You remember the story.
And their complaint was, this speaker is a right-wing corporatist in the, just everything hateful. And I remember reading this thinking, well, I didn't know who they had picked. Who?
Margaret Thatcher, right?
Who? Yeah. Did they pick? Who's it? It was Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Hillary Clinton was supposed to give the graduation speech. And from the point of view of the radical progressives at Scripps College, Hillary Clinton is just a right-wing conservative. It's amazing. It reminds me of one other example I just want to throw out as one of the great challenges here in branding within the political realm. You talked about the control that a private business has over a number of the products they produce, the control over like the way their products are sold, marketed, right? There are people who understand the business, understand the brand, can say, this is what our brand, I mean, sometimes literally they give their salespeople like talking points. Here's how you're going to talk about these things. I was also in California when Gray Davis was governor, and after one term, terrible things were happening. California didn't have electricity. I mean, it was absolutely outrageous. And there was a recall that it passed. It got the ballots. So there was a recall vote. And in California, and that ballot had 2 parts. You opened it up, and on one side it said, do you want to recall Gray Davis as governor of California? Recall, yes or no. And then the other side was, if Gray Davis is recalled, who shall be the next governor? And I don't remember the number. It was something like 113 Republicans. And for those of you who can't see me, I'm putting that in air quotes, because all you had to do was you had to get a certain number of signatures, and it wasn't that many. You had to get some signatures, pay a little fee, go register with the Secretary of State, and you were a Republican candidate for governor of California. And there were porn stars on there and movie celebrities, and there was some homeless guy on there. I mean, it was so ridiculous and over the top, right? And the point is, where a business has almost total control over branding and marketing, a party that can't even decide who its candidates are going to be, has virtually zero control at that point.
Well, so let's finish by talking about that, because I still believe it can be done. The question is, it takes 2 or 3 things that the party has to commit to. And if they do it well, it would have such a dramatic influence on how things go. The first is you have to have a clear message. What is our brand? What is the brand we want to be? Not just putting out there. I think we talked about this. We've done so many podcasts now. This is like 129 or 130. One of our early podcasts, probably 100 podcasts ago, was that we were talking about the Republican Party when they were trying to come up with their platform. We talked like I was talking about. At one point, I think they just said, whatever Donald Trump stands for, that's our platform, right? Our platform is Donald Trump.
Right.
That's not a platform and that's not a brand. You can't say our brand is Donald Trump. Our platform is our brand. So my thought is, if you can start with, here's our platform, here's our brand, this is what we stand for, then you have to do 2 other things. One, you have to properly incentivize candidates to embrace it. That is the most important thing. You have to incentivize them, and you do that in 2 ways. You do that, one, by giving them the tools to say, look, if you embrace our brand, we're going to give you all kinds of things to help you go get elected. We're going to go out there and we're going to give you the flyers and the banners and host the events and give you the opportunities to show that you reflect our brand and you're a part of the brand. You're on board. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, we're going to go out and on your behalf, we're going to educate people as to why this brand is important. So those are the 2 things. You have to have a brand, and then you have to have the incentives to get people to give them the things to embrace it, and also give them the money or the reason that you have to instruct people for the reason that they should embrace it.
Right.
So if the Republican Party came up with a solid, here is our platform, here's our brand, and we are going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars instead of just throwing it out and around and doing whatever they do with it right now. We're going to invest our money into actually interacting with the public to explain, why do free markets work? Why are free markets good? Why is religious liberty important? If that is their brand, in fact, and that becomes the big problem, the big question. But if they could actually show, we're going to go out and teach people on your behalf, and all you have to do is say, I'm the candidate that's going to represent this brand, and I have all these tools that the Republican Party gave me to do it. You could convince people. You could actually run on a brand.
You've just pointed to one of the great permanent challenges, in some ways, the great challenge. And the founders were very aware of this. What you laid out is an alternative. It's an alternative. And part of me, I really want my fellow Americans to live up to what you just described, where there could be a brand that involves ideas and principles and concepts. And then you have candidates who embrace those principles and ideas and there's an educational element reminding or teaching citizens why these ideas and principles and concepts are important. The other alternative is a nation of people who ignore principles and ideas and concepts and instead really flock around cults of personality, form cults. That is the alternative. And I'm reminded as I'm listening to you talk, the greatest exposition of constitutional Republican government, certainly in American history and arguably in all of history, the Federalist Papers. The word demagogue appears twice. There are 85 essays in that book. That word appears in essay number 1 and in essay number 85. Literally the first
bookends.
And bookends. And I have pondered that. I've been reading and studying that book, teaching that book for many years. My take on that is that, and this was Hamilton who put them there. I mean, it could just be pure accident, pure coincidence that this word demagogue, just happens to appear twice, and it's the first paper number 1 and then the final one. I think it's a tool. It's a literal representation of the great threat that surrounds constitutional self-government, the problem of demagoguery, that you can have this great constitution, you can have separation of powers, you can have good ideas and principles and concepts, all these things. And the challenge, the threat is people will always gravitate toward personalities. And the truth is, even with all the popular presidents, and including both presidents you and I probably like and agree on, and presidents we didn't like, the truth is, whether it's a Lincoln, or an FDR. There were likely many people who voted for those presidents who really didn't understand what they stood for.
Oh, without a doubt.
They liked them. Somehow the brand was a personal brand. Something resonated emotionally. I mean, I'm quite confident, say, Franklin Roosevelt, people weren't voting for Roosevelt because he was representing grand foundational principles of justice and constitutional government. He was just saying that we're going to give you free stuff and don't ask me how, because I don't quite know yet.
Well, or it got worse when you talk about George W. Bush and Barack Obama. I heard Republicans, huge numbers of Republicans who couldn't justify why they were voting for George Bush. And yet they'd say, yeah, but man, I just want to watch football on a Sunday with him. I want to be at his ranch, watching football on a Sunday, drinking a beer with him. He'd be so much fun to hang out with. I want to go on a hunting trip with him. All of those types of things.
Yeah.
But the mere fact that they couldn't tell you why they were voting for him or what they expected from him gave him that leeway to go do whatever he wanted. And that's where we got things like No Child Left Behind and other massive progressive programs by a supposed Republican president.
I'm going to weave in an example that comes outside the political realm. And I just want people to think about this as we wind things down. Arguably, the most successful religious movement in Western history, probably in the history of the world, has been the movement of Christianity. Christianity as a religion that went from a tiny, tiny little number to having millions of people around the world. And that religion very much does, in a decisive respect. It is literally, and I'm not saying this in a demeaning way. I'm saying this as a social science observer of phenomena. It is a cult of a personality. Mm-hmm. It literally revolves around a person who, and there are images of him depicted hanging on a cross, and all. Yeah. It is about Jesus. You're either with Jesus or you're not. You either love Jesus or you're not. That's the foundational question. And I think there's a reason that a religion like that revolves around a person, a personality. He has a name. He has, right? We know the names of his friends. We know what he looks like. People have that kind of personal connection. And when the founders set up this constitutional republic, they made it very clear, look, this is a government. This isn't a religion. This isn't going to save your soul. This is a government who only has a few basic jobs, right? It's just supposed to protect your rights. It's not here to save your soul or lead you to eternity in heaven or anything like that. So don't look to politicians the way Christians in the Western world look at Jesus, right? You're making a huge mistake. There shouldn't be these cults of personalities. There should be a constitutional structure that limits power. There are elections, right, that are based on discussions of that constitutional arrangement, what government's going to do. And I think that's why Hamilton put the words demagogue at the beginning and the end, because that is the great temptation.
Yes.
Is we'll forget about the structures and the principles, and we'll just gravitate towards personalities that make us feel good.
And for further evidence of what you're arguing, that he intentionally just did that, we did see him use other terms for the same purpose throughout the entire book.
Yes.
So he intentionally left the word demagogue out and replaced it with other things like so-called leaders, charlatans. He used words like that throughout the book, or throughout, I shouldn't say the book, throughout the other Federalist Papers, 2 through 84. He used other words to intentionally, I mean, it would be hard to imagine he used demagogue in the first book, demagogue in the last book, but he chose to use leader and charlatan,
right,
and politician throughout the middle.
And I want to be really clear here, right? This my comments they're not meant to be a commentary on Christianity. They're meant to be a commentary on American politics. When large numbers of citizens start to look at their candidates in ways they would look at a savior, or for that matter, a devil. Mm-hmm. We are in we're really thinking in ways that are perverse and that are not aligned with reality, because the truth is they're not devils and they're certainly not saviors. They're self-interested politicians and human beings. And what we need is this discussion to go back to the ideas, the principles, the concepts, the 3-part plan that you laid out. that's the way to get it done. That's the way to run a constitutional republic.
Well, and the further proof of what you're saying, the further thing it proves that I think is maybe one of the most important things that we can wrap on is it proves that human nature is static. Everything you just described is proof that human nature is actually static. Human nature doesn't change like progressives would like us to believe. Human nature is what it is based on exactly how the founders saw it, exactly how Aristotle talked about it. Human nature is static, whether it's Jesus or it was somebody from before, or even you get into like Genghis Khan or any of these other so-called leaders.
Think of all the Caesars and pharaohs and emperors who had large numbers of people genuinely believe they were deities.
Yeah.
I mean, Egyptians thought Pharaoh was a god. They didn't just think of him as, king who has special political power. They thought he was a god. There were Romans who thought Caesar was God, not right. Connected to God, not God, like was actually a God. And how is it those things happen? Because human beings, this is just this permanent part of human nature, right? Human beings want someone they can relate to, connect to, makes them feel secure, makes them feel safe. And that problem of demagoguery, Hamilton was right. It literally does surround. It's always around this great challenge of trying to govern ourselves constitutionally as a republic.
That's the great challenge of what we're doing. That's the great challenge of the Vino Veritas Society, to guard the ideas of the founding, to guard the principles, to try to remind people that don't be fooled by people who claim to be demagogues or leaders or charlatans or anything else. Go back to the principles and stick to the ideas of the American founding.
And we're going to do that, Dave. We're going to blaze a trail helping Americans understand how to brand their country, how to brand, I love your phrase, how to brand the Republic
right.
of the United States, how to brand the Republican Party, how to brand ourselves as freedom-loving citizens. All of that is part of guarding the American idea.
Well, as we continue to do that, we will continue to be the guardians, no somos custodes.